One of the points this presentation seeks to make is that education must necessarily be viewed as the primary agency responsible for the salutary status of the culture of which it is a part. In addition, to utilize its vital role, it must consciously and volitionally embody those philosophical elements which serve to directly promote and optimize the salutogenic thoughts and practices of the members of any society. A second point is that an exploration of a contemporary philosophical movement, which is clearly within the orthodox Hindu philosophical tradition, together with its representative educational system, represents a viable option in the search for solutions to understanding various educational and consequent social problems of many countries. The philosophies comprising the Hindu tradition interrelate to effect a universal unified philosophical system, that is, the individual systems are mutually complementary. Of particular importance for these efforts are the well-defined and elegant cosmogonic and epistemological doctrines and the ontology of man inherent in the tradition. The subject, philosophical system provides universally applicable prescriptive principles and practices, adjudged necessary and sufficient for the achievement of the avowed goals. The system consequently may be viewed as explicative, prescriptive, and pragmatic. In contradistinction to Western philosophy, the orthodox Hindu system has existed totally intact and virtually unchanged, except for developments rendering it more coherent and determinate for untold millennia. It has withstood the rigors of ceaseless disputation and of principal importance. It has revealed its efficacy through consistent personal application with attendant goal realization. A faithfully represented educational system is viewed as necessarily embodying both the salient principles and the prescriptive of the philosophical system from which it is derived. A likewise faithful implementation of the intrinsic pedagogy and curriculum by carefully selected and trained teachers, who are themselves products of the process, should evidence positive results. Dominant prevailing Western philosophies and systems of psychology seem unable to successfully arrest the rising tide of individual and collective human problems. The genesis of the problem at large is, in part, perceived as a fundamental absence of understanding regarding the true nature of man and the purpose of life, this being an apparent resultant of an overly rationalistic, speculative, and heterogeneous Western philosophical tradition and a dominant secular, scientific approach to life. The Indian philosophical tradition offers a diametrically opposed perspective, yet it is viewed as offering significant compatibility with Western modes of thought and expression, especially those associated with the scientific enterprise. In any serious investigation of an educational system, a review of the underlying philosophy is naturally and appropriately a first-order activity. This becomes a cardinal consideration when the review of an unfamiliar system is undertaken. An introduction to the philosophical tradition of Yoganand necessarily begins with the Vedas, specifically the Upanishads. The Vedas are the canons of the Hindu philosophical religious tradition, and the knowledge contained within them is deemed indisputable by virtue of its being regarded as directly revealed by God to man through the agency of the ancient saint and seers. The Upanishads form the fourth and final category of the Vedas. The Hindu philosophical system, based on the Upanishads, is known as Vedanta, meaning literally the end of the Vedas. In addition to concluding the Vedas, the Upanishads constitute the summary teachings of all the Vedas. As a note of interest, the synthesis of idealism and realism into a coherent system was eventually found to be necessary in Hindu philosophy. The obvious problem, which necessitated this synthesis, centers on the fact that, while man may rationally subscribe to a doctrine of pure idealism, he is ever confronted by the apparent realism inherent in his day-to-day awareness and activity. Deweyson explains the evolution of this necessary fusion. The gradual development of an Upanishadic-based system, that is Hindu philosophy, consists in the increasingly thorough interweaving of a fundamental thought, originally idealistic, with the materialistic requirements of the empirical consciousness, which made their influence more and more felt. These tendencies reached their climax first in post-Vedic times in the general system, at once theological and philosophical, which was shaped by the hands of Badrayan and his commentator Shankar, and in which full account was taken of the demand, both of the idealism and the realism, by distinguishing between a higher and lower knowledge. This doctrine of the identity of God and soul thus constitutes the nuclear thought of the Upanishads and, consequently, of orthodox Indian philosophy. It is, to be certain, the core doctrine in the philosophy and teachings of Yoganand. There are, however, certain principal problems this assertion, God equals soul, raises. Among these are: 1. If our true nature is essentially the same as God's, what is it, and why don't we experientially, consciously know it? 2. Given that we don't know it, can we come to know it, and, if so, by what means? 3. For what reasons do we not know it? And 4. What are the conditions and consequences resulting from our unknowingness? These problems and others are addressed in variant, albeit typically, not entirely coherent and indeterminate ways, in the Upanishads. And it was precisely because of this latter difficulty, and it was not a minor one, that the 6 systems of Hindu philosophy gradually came into existence. This section addresses the subject of Yoganand's educational philosophy from 2 basic perspectives, viz., the goal of life and the nature of man. Centering on these 2 topics, albeit on only several facets of each, in addition to what has already been stated, enables a sufficient number of salient points to be derived to sketch out the philosophical foundations of education in Yoganand's work. The approach taken is to discuss the topics first and derive the foundational elements last. The list of elements finally offered is neither inclusive nor exhaustive, as that is beyond the scope of this brief presentation, rather it is intended as representative. There are different approaches one can take to ascertain what the goals of life are in Yoganand's teachings, but there is no latitude for interpretation when it comes to defining the one goal as Sri Yukteswar ji refers to it. The one goal is of course liberation. It is the primary goal and discussion begins with it. The concept of liberation is an often misunderstood one. Consequently, it is a subject frequently relegated to speculative enterprise or fundamentalist fervor. Yet, in the mystical tradition of the world's major religions, it is the central factor. Unquestionably, liberation is the unalloyed lone goal in the tradition and philosophy of Yoganand. And in his educational philosophy, it is a cornerstone. A brief overview of this subject serves to render its immediate import for education more evident. First, consider Sri Yukteswar's interesting thesis statement on how liberation becomes the one goal. When man understands, even by way of inference, the true nature of this creation, the true relation existing between this creation and himself, and when he further understands that he is completely blinded by the influence of darkness, Maya, and that it is the bondage of darkness alone, which makes him forget his real self and brings about all his sufferings, he naturally wishes to be relieved from all these evils. This relief from evils or liberation from the bondage of Maya becomes the prime object of his life. Yoganand contends the principal role of education is to instruct one in how to live rightly, and this must certainly entail helping one over suffering and delusion, that is, it being the prime object of his life. Then the educative process must in some tangible way address the true nature of creation, the true nature of oneself, and the true relationship obtaining between creation and oneself. It was earlier stated that liberation was also referred to as self-realization. Yoganand defines this process as the knowing, in body, mind and soul, that we are one with the omnipresence of God, that we do not have to pray that it come to us, that we are not merely near it at all times but that God's omnipresence is our omnipresence, that we are just as much a part of Him as we ever will be. All we have to do is improve our knowing. Yoganand's definition of self-realization is interesting to consider from several perspectives. First, he is clearly reaffirming the Vedic dictum that art thou, that is, God is equal to soul. In doing so, he is also affirming that all knowledge already resides within man, and there being none other to acquire from without, for none other exists. And he is equally clear in his final statement that it is possible to access this infinitude of knowledge, and further one has a tacit responsibility to do so. This is reaffirmed in his statement regarding attainment of the supreme goal. There have been times when charges were made against Indian philosophy, claiming it to be dreamy, abstract, and not life-affirming. From all that is evident in Yoganand's teachings, such charges appear utterly erroneous. In articulating his How to Live philosophy, Yoganand repeatedly asserts the need to be successful, content, balanced, and happy to take charge of one's existence in a willful, responsible, and self-directed manner. Two goals of life, which are logically subordinate to liberation, yet essential to it, are success and self-analysis. Success in Yoganand's context is not simply defined in such terms as wealth, status, power, and the like. It reaches into far deeper realms of human concerns. He defines success, as one example, in terms of inner peace and mental control. Your success can only be measured by the extent to which your inner peace and mental control enable you to be happy under all circumstances. That is real success. When you can look within and your conscience is clear, your reason unprejudiced, your will be firm yet flexible, and your discrimination strong, and when you are able to obtain at will the things you need and the things you consider worthwhile, you are a success. Success in all endeavors, both inner and outer, is an important factor in Yoganand's philosophy. His statements on how success is actually to be measured and the criteria for real success will be seen to contribute markedly to his philosophy of education. Another important goal in Yoganand's teachings is self-analysis. In Vedic philosophy, the concept of free will is firmly upheld, but acknowledged to be substantially usurped in most people by the numbing power of accumulated habits and desires, compulsions, and the like. As Yoganand puts it, man is like a puppet. The strings of his habits, emotions, passions, and senses make him dance to their bidding. They bind his soul. To effectively claim and exercise free will, one must consequently free oneself from these encumbrances. Self-analysis thus becomes the key to eventual full freedom of choice and action. He goes on to indicate the basics of the self-analysis process and points out the importance for it. What stands out in this discussion is not only the obvious importance of the self-analysis process, but a unique alternative perspective regarding the perennial nature-nurture controversy. Everyone should learn to analyze himself dispassionately. Write down your thoughts and aspirations daily. Find out what you are, not what you imagine you are, because you want to make yourself what you ought to be. Most people don't change because they don't see their own faults. Everyone is the product of his heredity and environment. Your environment is the result of your true heredity, the traits and desires acquired by you in past lives. This heredity of past incarnations has led to your being born in the particular family and environment in which you now find yourself. A man takes birth in a certain family, a particular social and national environment, owing to specific causes, his own past actions. Therefore, man is the architect of his own destiny. One can almost predict what he will be in his next life by analyzing his dominant interests and habits in this one. Given this description on how one essentially creates one's own existence, it follows that the process of living life rightly will necessarily entail continued self-analysis and self-effort, so as to live life in a prescribed manner to achieve a defined goal. Not surprisingly, the one goal, self-realization, is that particular goal. Yoganand confirms this and addresses the process further. Self-analysis is important for the progress of the soul. We can alter ourselves very quickly with strong determination, but without it, one does not change effortlessly or in a minute the habit pattern of years. To eradicate a habit of long standing, you must apply the full strength of your determination in counter-activity until the bad habit is worn out. Most persons don't have the necessary patience. But everyone should feel encouraged by this truth, or whatever you have created or done, you can undo. When you analyze what you are, have a firm desire to banish your weaknesses and to make yourself what you ought to be, don't allow yourself to be overwhelmed with discouragement at the revelation of your shortcomings that honest self-analysis brings. There are numerous other goals of life elucidated in Yoganand's teachings, but one readily finds them as both equally subordinate and necessary to the one goal as the preceding two. It is interesting to note the apparent equal importance Yoganand ascribes to each. It becomes evident that his fundamental prescription seems to be to address life in a willful, aware, responsible, balanced, and devotional manner. What this really means, obviously, is to approach each of life's goals in this prescribed manner, so as to efficiently effect the one goal. In Yoganand's philosophy, man is principle. Accordingly, his teachings may be said to conform to the ancient dictum, "Man, know thyself." However, as is evident in his writings, the knowing of the self is necessarily preceded by the knowing of the self. Present purposes considered, the nature of the self and its relation to the self is reviewed from the perspective of the nature of the body of man. Subsequent discussion relative to man as body is not, however, referring to body in the historically bifurcated body-mind context, as this is not possible for reasons made evident. Yoganand states that the human body is the most intricate of all his creations. An idea of the magnitude of this intricacy is suggested in the following words. A single original cell, the united sperm and ovum, divides, and by multiplication of the process builds up trillions of cells around itself to create the bodily temple that houses a divine soul consciousness. You don't realize how much energy is locked in even 1 little gram of flesh. Its release would spread countless electrons far into space. And the power and extent of the consciousness that is present in the body is beyond human conception. Though we are made of flesh, behind these gross cells are electrical currents, life currents. And behind these subtle energies are the thoughts and perceptions. The creation of the body of man is intimately associated with creation itself. It, therefore, logically follows that the evolutional pattern of man's body follows a schema similar to that of creation. Proceeding from this perspective, Yoganand discusses the nature of the body of man. The microcosm, or body of man, came into being first as a vibratory thought form, the causal body. This, in turn, produced the grosser vibrations that make up the astral or energy body of man, which produces the still grosser vibrations that structure the solid physical body. Just as man uses electrically projected light and shadows and sounds to create a picture of a human being on a movie screen, so the cosmic operator combines various thought-frozen vibrations of cosmic light and energy to produce in man's consciousness the picture of a solid physical body. Yoganand makes reference to 3 bodies: the causal, astral, and physical. In his philosophy, these 3 bodies are perceived as 3 sheaths that successively encase the soul. Liberation is, according to this philosophy, a matter of working one's way back through the vibrational creation-producing spectrum of God's creative consciousness. Sri Yukteswar Ji provides a terse summary of the nature and relationship of the 3 bodies of man, or the 3 sheaths of the soul. In 35 thought categories of the causal body, God elaborated all the complexities of man's 19 astral and 16 physical counterparts. By condensation of vibratory forces, first subtle, then gross, he produced man's astral body and finally his physical form. According to the law of relativity, by which the prime simplicity has become the bewildering manifold, the causal cosmos and causal body are different from the astral cosmos and the astral body. The physical cosmos and the physical body are likewise characteristically at variance with the other forms of creation. The fleshly body is made of the fixed, objectified dreams of the Creator. The dualities are ever present on earth: disease and health, pain and pleasure, loss and gain. Human beings find limitation and resistance in the 3-dimensional matter. Clearly, from what Sri Yukteswar stated regarding the 3 bodies of man, these bodies do not stand in an insular relationship, they are causally interrelated and dynamically interactive. Sri Yukteswar relates the manner in which the 3 bodies are perceivable in physical man. The interpenetration of man's three bodies is expressed in many ways through his threefold nature. In the wakeful state on earth, a human being is conscious more or less of his three vehicles. When he is sensuously intent on tasting, smelling, touching, listening, or seeing, he is working principally through his physical body. Visualizing or willing, he is working mainly through his astral body. His causal being finds expression when man is thinking or diving deep in introspection or meditation. The cosmical thoughts of genius come to the man who habitually contacts his causal body. In this sense, an individual may be classified broadly as a material man, an energetic man, or an intellectual man. Now, there comes the critically important matter concerning the manner in which the three bodies are bound inextricably together and the process or processes by which the bonds are progressively broken and liberation is ultimately achieved. Sri Yukteswar again speaks, when man's desire to live is severely shaken by disease or other causes, death arrives, the heavy overcoat of flesh is temporarily shed. The soul, however, remains encased in the astral and causal bodies. The cohesive force by which all three bodies are held together is desire. The power of unfulfilled desires is the root of all of man's slavery. Physical desires are rooted in egotism and sense pleasures. The compulsion or temptation of sensory experience is more powerful than the desire force connected with astral attachments or causal perceptions. Astral desires center around enjoyment in terms of vibration. Astral desires are thus connected with an astral being's power to precipitate all objects and experiences as forms of light or as condensed thoughts or dreams. Causal desires are fulfilled by perception only. The nearly free beings, who are encased only in the causal body, see the whole universe as realizations of the dream ideas of God. They can materialize anything and everything in sheer thought. Causal beings work out their desires by materializing them instantly. Those who find themselves covered only by the delicate veil of the causal body can bring universes into manifestation, even as does the Creator. Because all creation is made of the cosmic dream texture, the soul, thinly clothed in the causal, has vast realizations of power. A soul, being invisible by nature, can be distinguished only by the presence of its body or bodies. The mere presence of a body signifies that its existence is made possible by unfulfilled desires. When desirelessness is attained through wisdom, its power disintegrates the two remaining vessels, the astral and the causal bodies. The tiny human soul emerges, free at last. It is one with the measureless amplitude. The subject of desire and its role in keeping the soul bound to delusion is so strong in Yoganand's philosophy that a statement of his must be included. In this statement, he renders the relationship between the doctrine of karma and desire lucid. To become the friend of God, man must overcome his own karma or actions that ever urge him to spineless acquiescence in the magic delusions of the world. Knowledge of the iron law of karma encourages the earnest seeker to find the way of final escape from its bonds. Because the karmic slavery of human beings is rooted in the desires of Maya-darkened minds, it is with mind control that the yogi concerns himself. The various cloaks of karmic ignorance are laid away and man views himself in his native essence. It is with this key disclosure, it is with mind control that the yogi concerns himself, that the root action in Yoganand's philosophy stands revealed. He elaborates this point. A true yogi, withholding his thoughts, will, and feelings from false identification with bodily desires, uniting his mind with superconscious forces in the spinal shrines, thus lives in the world as God hath planned. He is impelled neither by impulses from the past nor by fresh motivations of human weakness. Receiving fulfillment of his supreme desire, he is safe in the heaven of inexhaustibly blissful spirit. This concludes discussion concerning the nature of man, as expressed through the subject of man as body and the role of desire in maintaining his three essential bodies, all vital doctrine in the philosophy of Paramahansa Yoganand. Conceiving man as a threefold being affords the opportunity for a more facilitative grasp of man's intrinsic and essential nature. This, in turn, enables a more pragmatic focus when it comes to attending to these factors in an educational context. Yoganand unequivocally affirms that it is only when balanced attention to all three aspects, the physical, mental, and spiritual, is achieved, that true and complete education can be realized. And, as it has been earlier stated, only when true and complete education is effected can man be said to know how to live life rightly. Based on this premise, Yoganand referred to his educational institutions as how to live schools.